We're on 23 now, aren't we? Yeah, I know, but I keep on forgetting what the number is. Hello, welcome to episode 23 of the Deafened podcast. We have a mega special superstar guest on the show today. VJ, introduce yourself.
Yay.
Welcome, VJ.
No, shut up. We have Mr. Stuart Halloway. Hello, Stuart.
Hi, VJ. Hi, Ray.
Hi.
Hello, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, it's absolutely a pleasure. It's great. Stuart, you tweeted in 2016, Stuart, that you left your iPhone stopwatch running and then you felt guilty. So I did this myself recently. I did a bike ride and I finished the bike ride and left my stopwatch running for another 10 minutes and I felt guilty as well. So maybe we have to think about talk about or admit what makes us feel guilty now. You know? How about you, VJ?
Actually, I'm not. Okay, maybe I was feeling guilty because I stopped saying fuck, and which I just did again. I think.
Is that why you stopped feeling guilty?
Yeah, I think so.
Think about that. Okay.
Yeah, I need to contemplate it again. But are we sure? Okay, we're gonna start with what the guilty stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll think about it because there are a lot of things. I don't want to reveal it in the public, forum, but we'll see.
Okay, maybe we'll put that in some outtakes afterwards. Yeah. I think I've got some video evidence of you in a Russian hotel, and I'm going to hold it against you. Yeah.
Oh, coming from the United States, I can tell you that never works. You think that's going to work, but it never does.
Oh, Jesus Christ. It seems like guilt used to be something that we had, and we're in a post-Trump era, and guilt is just completely finished. Just like everything, shame and guilt we're just finished with that now. All human guilt and shame is finished. I said it could escalate quickly, Stuart. I'm sorry, but you started it.
No, it's my fault. And I actually don't think that. Before I started my life as a software developer, I was working on a PhD in history, and I take a much more long view, cyclical view on these things. And, every generation as we age through our lives, you see these things happening and you're like, oh, this is really terrible. And then, your generation finishes up its time carrying the torch and it keeps getting carried. So I'm reasonably optimistic as a person in general, and I'm optimistic about politics in the United States, even though there's a lot of crazy stuff going on right now.
Yeah, actually, since we're getting onto a slightly serious subject, talking about history PhDs, I was listening to this audiobook by Timothy Snyde, who, if you're a historian, you might know about. He wrote a book called On Tyranny, which is all about the kind of markers for tyrannical regimes. And he was basing it on 20th century regimes like Stalin and Hitler. And he was actually saying that, regardless of your optimism, he's saying that there are some quite considerable markers at this moment in the US that may signify a move towards a tyrannical regime. So...
Yeah, I think that's out there, but I think that we also live in the age of the internet, and we have an ability to communicate as a set of global citizens to laugh at nationalist level stupidity where it's happening that did not exist before. And I think that a super chilling thing would be, successful internet censorship, nation to nation among nations that are thought of having reasonably free speech and free press. But when that's not happening, I think that it is a great counterbalance to local silliness.
Yeah, we do have a lot of that coming up now, don't we? With various governments saying the tech companies, they should open up their encryption backdoors and stuff like this to allow this kind of government censorship and activities. So there are some threats out there for sure. Even to the internet. Yeah, this was meant to be a light-hearted introduction, but
Yeah.
Great start. Right, VJ, sort us out. Come on.
Yes, I'm trying to keep my political thoughts for myself. But anyway, I think that we have enough discussion about tyranny and other things. So we can just get back to whatever the fun things that are happening in the Clojure world. And we have, well, can we call you like second in command, or what? I mean, how does it work in Clojure for you? Like Rich says, call me great leader and you're supreme leader, or how does this work?
Well, I think Rich is pretty clearly the BDFL for as long as he wants to do that, and I'm hopeful he'll want to do it for a bit longer at least, as I think he does a very good job. And then there are other people who take on different roles. I mean, the person who probably spends the most hours in the week, probably more hours than there are to be awake, worrying about this stuff, in addition to Rich, is Alex Miller, of course. You guys have spoken to him before. My role is I'm a committer on Clojure, and I read every line of code that goes in. So I don't think there's a particular name for that. I would like to say that's a careful committer who doesn't ever make mistakes, but that also means that everything that goes in that's not as good as it could be, it's at least partially my fault. But it's been quite an interesting role, and I've been doing that for at least, I can't remember when I started doing that, at least probably since 1.2. So through a lot of major releases, reading all of the lines of code that go in.
Yeah. So am I making up the history if I remember? Maybe I remember it from some of the discussions, or I don't exactly remember where I heard. Maybe it was my imagination. But so you met with Rich when he was presenting at the JVM Languages Summit, and then that's how it all started, right? Because you're doing Ruby at that time.
So that is pretty close. That is pretty close to right. So I was, Justin Gatland and I had created Relevance in 2003, and we had taken our company and switched it from primarily enterprise Java to primarily Ruby on Rails. And we had made that switch fairly early in 2005. And we made that switch because Justin wrote a blog post about productivity in Ruby and got slashdotted, and we were serving our own blog and our server melted. Fortunately,
good old times.
Fortunately, our server was not itself software we wrote, so we were able to wave that off a little bit. But after having in my career made 3 or 4 language switches that were dictated by employment situations, and then one language switch to Ruby that was chosen, but was mostly chosen from a set of outside influences, right? I got to know pragmatic Dave Thomas, traveling around and speaking at conferences in the United States, and James Duncan Davidson and other people who were Ruby enthusiasts to varying degrees. I decided that it was important at the level that I wanted to reach as a software developer to do a more systematic search. And so my interest in Clojure grew out of a systematic search. It was called at the time the search for Java.next. And so trying to find, the next thing there. And so I discovered Clojure, and it probably was about a year before that JVM Language Summit. So I started writing a book about Clojure. I decided that this was the thing, and I started writing a book, which ended up being the first published book on Clojure. And then
that's from Pragmatic Programmers, right? The Swan
that's
book.
Right. And Alex Miller is currently just started the 3rd edition. So I think the electronic alphas of the 3rd edition of that book are just coming out right now. And so I was working on the book, and then because of my interest in Clojure, Brian Getz said you ought to come to the JVM Language Summit. So I did, and met Rich there, and I'm like, hey, I'm the guy that's writing the book about your language. And he's like, hey, I'm the guy that wrote the language. And, we started talking, and we hit it off. And I said, I would love to have, any kind of feedback you would provide on the book. And he said, it's so awesome to have a book, that we can release essentially contemporaneously with Going 1.0. So we were able to coordinate that and release the book, along with Clojure Going 1.0. So that was a great, I think a great beginning. And if you look at the history of other programming languages, they had to wait, often years, before a book
to get a book.
A book. So it was a good start.
Yeah. I think there are a couple of most important questions, because usually when people listen to the podcast, they want to have the, immediate TLDR sort of thing. So first of all, are you a vegetarian?
So I spent about 3 years being a vegetarian when I was in my 20s. And my
3 good years.
My primary reasoning for being a vegetarian was environmental, and I continue to care about those issues. But I also think it's important to be an effective leader and persuader. So I persuaded 2 other people to become vegetarian, without like pushing them. It wasn't an evangelism thing. It was, I explained why I was doing it, and they have both.
So you mean something like My Way or Highway?
No. I just, I just said why I was doing it, and then these two people became vegetarians, and they have both remained vegetarians for life. So I feel like I don't have to anymore since they have it covered.
Oh man, it's like 2 in, 1 out. They've covered your bets.
So there is net effect still one vegetarian, one more vegetarian in
yes,
this
we
world.
have. I feel like my life contribution is one net vegetarian in the world. So that's pretty good. And my family, we enjoy vegetarian cooking, and so we do eat a fair amount of vegetarian food, but no meatitarian if I had to choose.
But there was a question actually from somebody on Slack, Sean Mahood,
Beef
saying,
jerky.
You had vegetarian beef jerky. What is that? That's very bizarre.
So I have this example when I'm introducing Datomic's query language.
Oh right,
that is about it's about a fictional store in Montana that sells jerky of various kinds, and it just depends on how flip a mood I'm in, how much that story gets embellished.
Okay.
But having searched back in my memory, I'm sure that story has included strange vegetarian jerky excursions. But I actually I enjoy beef and buffalo jerky, but I'm not aware of any actual vegetarian jerky.
Only in the fictitious stores. Okay.
Right. Totally fictitious.
Right.
So one net vegetarian and some fake news about vegetarian beef jerky.
Yes, fine. Fake news. Good.
Let's get to the most important question of this podcast. So, Emacs are other random shit that nobody cares about.
Oh my! So I actually started my, I feel like I'm obliged to represent for where I came from, and I started my career in the late '80s modifying Emacs to support Chinese. That was my first programming job. And I took that job because it was the highest paying job in work-study. It was $6 an hour. So I worked on extending Emacs to support Chinese characters for $6 an hour. But I have stuck with Emacs with, I visited other editors, but I've stayed with Emacs ever since. But I'm not particularly religious on the topic.
There. So Emacs it is.
Yes, an answer that's guaranteed to please no one. Right?
Yes, exactly.
I smoked Emacs, but I didn't inhale.
Okay, so the most important questions are now settled. So we can go to the. I think there were a lot of questions on Twitter when we started. So before we get into that one, so you can you give us? You said you changed the languages multiple times from Java to Ruby to Clojure. So can you tell us how did you start Relevance? Maybe a bit before in the from programming history.
Yeah, sure.
Your programming history.
So I worked at a very interesting company from 1998 until 2003. It was a software training company in the United States called Developmentor, and this company prided itself on having probably the best amount of outside Microsoft expertise anywhere. And the technical go-to guy there was Don Box, who is now at Microsoft working on the Xbox. I think no relation. And
he just named it after himself.
Yeah, they just named. No, I think the name was there before he got there. Embarrassingly, in terms of contribution to software history, Developmentor was one of the signatories on the SOAP spec. So I'm not sure that's a thing to be, incredibly proud of at this point.
Well, Rich taught C++, didn't he? So I guess you've got equal sins there.
Everybody has skeletons in their closet. So, working there, I got to meet a range of people not geographically bound. Right, it was a travel education kind of gig, and so I got to know a lot of incredibly sharp people. And what happened back in the day was that Microsoft had this technology called Microsoft Transaction Server. Then
MTS,
Java came out with this technology called Enterprise Java Beans, which was partially a ripoff of Microsoft Transaction Server. And we saw that as an opportunity to branch the business out from Microsoft to Java. So I I made the switch from Microsoft technology to Java technology kind of in a backwards way by knowing a tool chain that had great similarity that ran on top of the language, and then working my way back into learning Java. And then in 2001, you had the towers fall down, and everybody in the United States stops traveling. And working in a job that relies on your customers to travel to your city for training becomes a very, very unpleasant deal for several years. It took a long time to recover. And in fact, it had not fully recovered by 2003 when I decided that I had had enough. I mean, we bailed water for a couple of years, and development survived, and that was great. But Justin Getland, who worked there with me, and I decided that we wanted to go it on our own and do consulting and actually help people build stuff with the technology we were talking about. And our expertise then was still relevant Microsoft expertise to some degree, but more Java. And so what I would call kind of early agile Java, and people that were early adopters of Spring and Hibernate and things like that. So we were doing that and helping people use those things, and really started the company with a clear idea of the kind of lifestyle we wanted to lead, and a clear idea that we wanted to stay on what we perceived to be the leading edge of business use of technology, and not necessarily a lot of wisdom about how to run a company. But fortunately, we've had 14 years to work on that now. So we've survived and gotten better over time.
I was about to ask that because 14 years is a long time for a company. And then, when you started the company as founders and now, so what changed? So what was the culture that you were going for? Because you said there is a certain lifestyle that you wanted to have with the company. Is there still core DNA that still there at Cognitect, because it has a big transition from Relevance to Cognitect?
So I think that certainly our interest in staying on what we perceive to be the cutting edge of technology has persisted throughout. And that means, switching technologies and switching things that you're interested in. After a few years, it became evident that to have the kind of impact that we wanted to have, we were going to have to do more than just be two people who, sort of flew in and flew out. And so, deeper engagement and doing entire projects. And so that led to, Relevance growing and hiring people and developing a larger presence. And then, following on that, the switch to Clojure led to, a new set of people who were interested in working for us at Relevance, a new set of customers and people who were interested in potentially working with us. So that was another big transition. And then when we started working with Clojure, at some point along that trajectory, we talked with Rich about that and said, hey, should this be a company that's primarily about Clojure? And if it is, would you want to be a part of that? And we decided, initially at least, instead, Rich said, well, let me show you this thing on a blackboard that I've been kind of interested in. And so he sketched out the ideas behind Datomic on a blackboard over the course of a couple of hours. And I injured my jaw as my jaw just dropped further and further and further. And to be honest, before that, I had never really even liked databases. Right? I had seen databases. I mean, for somebody who came up through the languages that I came up through and came up through the cultures that I came up through, there was a lot of the database is the least agile part of your tool chain. It's the thing you have the least opportunity to influence. And so just having the guts to say, we can change that level of the stack and make it something different. And of course, we benefited in a huge way from the NoSQL movement. If that had not happened, it would have been a lot harder to have had the business courage to say, yeah, we'll make a database that works differently and see, if everybody's still perfectly happy with SQL if they're going to want to do that. So we did that, and after having released Datomic, so Datomic just turned 5 in terms of public release, I guess 3 months ago. So it's been out for 5 years, and after that, sort of initial release, we got a lot of feedback from users. And as we internalized that feedback, one of the things we decided was that there really is a lot of synergy between Clojure and Datomic. And so it made sense to form Cognitect and to have, one company that was, a bunch of thought leadership in Clojure and the team behind Datomic, and able to explain, how Clojure works, why you want to use Clojure, how Datomic works, why you want to use Datomic, why in particular you might want to use them together, and that has worked very well for us. So that's been a good thing, and I think it's been a good thing for business users of Clojure, and that's certainly something. This is our day job, so we are interested in helping companies that want to use Clojure find a way to use Clojure, regardless of whether they use Clojure, regardless of whether it has any financial impact on Cognitect, because as we all know, with the sort of dominance of open source and programming languages, people have a lot of different choices. And so you want your own ecosystem to feel healthy and safe and know that there are going to be other people working in the space that you're working in.
So following on from that actually is because we had some topics around this stuff that we thought about, and since we're talking about Cognitect, and this is kind of the growing up story, maybe I don't know if you can share anything about what your plans are to grow the company. To maybe are you going to do the VC thing, or because obviously everyone knows on this podcast at least that you've got some pretty awesome technology in there. So if you are going to do VC, well, okay, maybe you can't talk about the details, but if you're not, then it would be interesting to know why not, or what your feelings are about how to grow a company like Datomic or Cognitect, or what you're doing. How do you get big, and do you want to get big?
So I think that if you read between the lines, in some ways we are answering that question in visible ways by our behavior. But to be explicit about it, if we were taking funding, clearly we were doing a terrible job at it, because we're not growing 5x every year and whatever. That's not the kind of thing. I'm actually neutral on that, right? I'm neutral on rapid growth or not rapid growth. But what I'm interested in is doing the technology right and getting the people bits right. And so we want to build great tech, and we want to be good people and work with good people. And so if we can grow faster while doing that, that's great. And if it takes time and requires patience, that's fine too. And that's been a mix of that. So, the company has been healthy and has grown some years and has been relatively flat other years. And, right now, it seems like there's an uptick in interest on the business side in Clojure. So if I had to guess right now, I would say that 2017 will be a growth year. Obviously, it's midway through the year, so I can't be 100% certain. Yeah. But I think that things are trending in a good direction. But it's driven more by who we want to be. And of course, the longer you don't do something like take VC funding, the less realistic it is to do. I mean, VCs want to have something tiny that they can put a small thing into and get a huge return. And we're already not a tiny little turtle egg, right? We're a small turtle that already successfully, got into the ocean and swam around a while. So we're less interesting to them, and we're not, that interested at this point, and haven't been. So that's okay.
Okay. Well, let's hope the turtle gets bigger. That's good, because it's turtles all the way down. We know that much.
That's right.
Okay. So, there was another one was, I think, about Cognitect, was that there was something you built recently about automated simulation testing. The kind of tools that you build in-house that you were talking about. There was a question from Jan Oberhageman on Twitter, I think, about whether or not you would open source this or whether you would make something more of it. Maybe you've even forgotten about it. I don't know.
No. So we have, we devised a simulation testing engine for Datomic.
Right.
While we were building Datomic. And we open sourced that several years ago as Simulant. And we have used that. Cognitect has used that in consulting engagements to do simulation testing for customers. And Mike Nygaard and Paul DeGrandis and Craig Andera and other people have worked on simulation testing tools and have open sourced them. So as far as I know, the things that we have done are open source. But in particular, I think that tweet mentioned Paul DeGrandis, and he is sort of an energizer human. So it's entirely possible that he has built 5 things in the last 2 weeks that I haven't heard of yet. So we can double check. But certainly, I think that generally, general purpose testing tools, I don't see a purpose in not having them be out there and released. It's not something you're going to I mean, I think having a full framework or something that's more targeted towards a vertical or something like that, you could make something commercial. But our testing tools, we build and we open source, and they include things like Test Generative and Cognitect, and we also support through Clojure's infrastructure testing tools that are developed not by us. So Cognitect people did not write much of the code in Test Check. And that turns out to be the most important piece underneath Spec in terms of the generative side of things.
Good transition there. Good transition.
Yeah, so I've got the outline.
You're a pro. We didn't rehearse this, but it seems like we should have done. Okay, so Spec. So Stuart. Spec. Yeah. I think probably many people who are listening to this will know about Spec, but can we just for the sake of completeness, maybe just remind us of the basic goals of Spec, because it obviously is going to be a huge thing going forward. So just to get us all on the same page, just want to quickly go through what the top tentpole items are.
Sure. So the one sentence I would use is that Spec is a standard, expressive, powerful, and integrated system for specifying Clojure programs. And those are, official words from Rich. And anyone who's seen Rich give conference talks complete with multiple dictionary definitions on slides, knows that we try to take words seriously. So to sort of fill those words in a little bit, obviously Spec is integrated, right? It was added to Clojure as a thing that's integrated in Clojure, and it touches Clojure in about 10 different places. And that represents careful thinking about all the places you would want to use this. And it is one of the value propositions of Spec to have tried to think carefully about, if you had specification, where in your language could you use it, and try to make sure it was being used in all those places and that it was suitable for all those places. And one reaction you can have to Spec, and this is a completely legitimate reaction, is I've seen all this before. Right? There's not, in a certain sense, there's nothing at all new about Spec. But I think it's a very tasteful combination of things in terms of how it's integrated. So that's the integrated part. I think having it be standard in the sense of everybody uses the same one instead of 10 different competing ones, not in the sense of, going to a standards body. We're not going to get ISO certified Spec or something like that. But I think having it be standard is important. And of course, the integration gives it a huge leg in that direction, right? It's the presumptive favorite. It's built in. And it's important that it do the things that people who have been using other specification tools in Clojure, wanted to do, so that it covers those needs. And then, in terms of being expressive and powerful, it's expressive in that it builds on what's already there. So any predicate that already exists in Clojure works in Spec. And it doesn't work with an adapter or a widget or something you have to add to it. It works. Likewise, all of the collection types in Clojure, of which there are few, and that's itself a value prop of Clojure, all of those things are fully integrated into Spec. So you have, out of the box with Spec, a set of tools for talking about the shape of data that's much richer than, say, the type system that people are used to coming from Java or C# or something like that. And then, another way to look at it is, does it cover the different use cases that people have for specification? So one thread leading into Spec is generative testing. Can I describe my programs with specifications and then have the language write tests for me? And I think we have done a good job with that. Another one is better error messages specifically from macros. So in Clojure, because it's a Lisp, you can extend the language with macros, and macros are notorious for being crazy powerful and being able to provide amazing extensions to the language and having completely opaque failure modes, right? So if you pass in the wrong stuff to the macro, you get a stack trace from the compiler or whatever. And so, being able to cover that use case. And if you look at what Spec does as the ability, the regular expression part of Spec in particular, because one of the things that macros do that is actually not very common elsewhere in Clojure is a lot of dependency on order. right? All over Clojure, we're always saying, let's use maps for this. Let's use maps for that. That's going to be flexible. That's going to be self-describing. But nobody writes their programs with maps. I mean, imagine what your function definition would look like if it was : fun name, colon arg list, colon body, or something like that. But but the ability of specs, the regular expression component of specs, is pointed directly at problems with macros. And if you go back and look at libraries that people have written in Clojure and tools that people have written to help Clojure programmers and talks that have been accepted at Clojure conferences over the past 5 years, there's this thread of how do we make macro problems, more understandable for users. So it covers that use case. It covers making development time safe. It covers, providing tools that you would not use in production, but you absolutely would want at development time. So instrumentation, for example, to say, let's tighten down everything in this program and show me if I'm doing something wrong. And then it supports ad hoc data validation. So it's completely suitable for you're making a web service endpoint that delivers JSON, doing a spec check at the front door on the way in and on the way out to make sure that you are producing and consuming the data that you expect. It's performant enough to be suitable for that kind of use. So I think that gets to the power of spec is covering this broad set of use cases.
Yeah. So this is recently it's been moved out of the core, right? So
I was just going to say it. The interesting point about 1.9 there is that you've I take your point about the integration, and but at the moment you've made a split in the alpha. So could you explain that a bit more, given your assertions about the integration, the need for integration here?
Right. So I'd like to, before I talk about the spec split, talk about what we mean when we say alpha on Clojure releases and in Clojure documentation, because I think that people have 3 or 4 different things that alpha might mean to them. One thing that alpha might mean is brand new. Another thing that alpha might mean is crappy. Another thing that alpha might mean is not tested very much, which might be crappy or might not. And another thing that alpha might mean is subject to change. Right? This is something that we don't consider fully baked, and so if you come to depend on it, you may be broken later.
Right.
In terms of things that are released in Clojure, the things that are marked alpha are only ever that last thing. Right? When you see something in Clojure or a contrib library, now I can't speak to every person who writes Clojure code, but when you see something in a Clojure library or a contrib library that says alpha, that means not brand new. I mean, it might or might not be brand new. It does not mean we think this might be crappy. It does not mean anything except subject to change. So having said that, spec is subject to change. We want to change spec. Spec's going to evolve. People are going to figure out ways to do things better. And so the namespace that spec now lives in as of the Alpha 16 release of Clojure has the word alpha not just in the Maven artifact, but in the actual namespace name. Yeah. And that's a warning to users that you really can't avoid seeing. Right? It's actually when you do your namespace reference in your project, you have to type the word alpha or let your IDE auto-complete the word alpha for you and say, hey, I'm using an alpha thing. And what you should take from that when it's coming from Clojure itself is not that this is crappy or filled with bugs or whatever, but that it is possible that this is going to get changed out from under you in the future. Now, having said that, I don't think we'll change a lot. I hope we don't change anything. Right? We aspire not to change anything. But there's definitely more likelihood of something in spec changing than something in Clojure changing. It's also the case that spec is likely to want to evolve more quickly than Clojure's release cycle, which is anywhere from 6 months to 18 months, between major Clojure releases historically. And so the reason for this split is to allow Clojure 1.9 to be released and allow spec to continue its own evolution without spec having to be held up for waiting for Clojure releases.
Okay. So just so I'm clear about that, does that mean that 1.9 itself will not be spec'd? Or are you in fact, you're still using it internally? Absolutely,
Clojure 1.9 will use spec internally and does already. And I hope that by the time we get to 1.9 done, that all the macros, right, those are the things that cause people the most beginner pain in Clojure. All the macros will have specs. Would be great. Several of them have specs right now, and so there's actually 3 libraries. There's Clojure itself, then there is Spec Alpha, and then there's Clojure Specs Alpha, which is specs for Clojure. And those can evolve independently as well. And so Clojure will be spec'd, and Clojure specs can get better. Spec itself can get better, and Clojure specs can get better without those things having to be dependent on Clojure's release cycle. And that's the objective.
Okay. Well, I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. There was another question, actually, which was like from Arno Boss, actually, on Twitter. And that was, do you have any, I mean, I guess it's still early days, but do you have any plans for building tools on top of Spec? Maybe apart from error messaging, which you kind of alluded to.
So, do I, Stuart Halloway, personally plan to build tools on Spec?
I'm thinking about, whether there'll be tools released in the... Okay, forget it. You take the question for what it is. Yeah.
I want to talk about this because I think it's incredibly important. I think it's important for people to... It's much harder to visualize the potential of a thing without a glamorous user interface.
Sure.
And so I would love to see people building glamorous user interfaces for Spec. And those are going to be context dependent. So, there's going to be an IntelliJ IDEA glamorous interface for Spec. There'll be a separate one for Eclipse. There'll be a separate one for Light Table. There'll be a separate one for
Emacs.
Whatever, Vim, Emacs, whatever. There's a million things to be built there. And there are all these people who are enthusiastic about making Clojure easier for people who are getting started. So here's a nice concrete idea, right? Clojure Spec is a tool that lets you draw red squiggly underlines smarter than static typing would let you draw red squiggly underlines. That stuff's not done yet, and it's IDE specific, right? Somebody needs to go and draw red squiggly underlines. This part of your data is broken. And it's much more general purpose than a type system, right? It doesn't have to be your program. It can be the JSON input to your web service is non-conformant. Here's a red squiggly underline, where it's non-conformant. And so, I think that Spec is a rich enabler of GUI tools. And those GUI tools are not reliant on any changes to Clojure, right? There's no need for Clojure to do anything to enable those tools tomorrow. And we're starting to see some of that. I know that I think some of the Clojure on iOS stuff has cool spec-enabled highlighting already. And I think that stuff is fantastic, and I would love to see more of it.
In terms of like Spec itself, you mentioned that it's alpha, it's subject to change. Is it about refining what you've got, or is it about, you think that there are some ideas that are still like not in the Spec world yet that you want to bring into that Spec world, or is that again just something that is you just want to leave it open to evolution? I guess the question is it kind of done, needs to be polished, or is it kind of still open? Is the door still open to new ways of doing things in Spec?
So I think that there's definitely a need for polish. There's no doubt. There are tickets right now for things that need to be done. There are things that are chapping me when I use it that need to be enhanced and fixed. And I'm easily satisfied. So we should get more input. And I would say it would be great. I mean, the biggest thing that would help with Spec would be for people to use it and provide experience reports. That's incredibly valuable, those experience reports. And so part of the answer is, the Clojure community is way, way smarter than any 1 or 10 of us. And so I would love to know what those stories are so we can all digest them and think about that. Having said that, I have a couple of immediate thoughts of things that are unlikely to have, further refinement in the 1.9 time frame, but I think are clearly, areas where things could substantially change, hopefully additively. One of them is test performance. And this gets into having a more Clojure-ish way to think about dependencies. I mean, right now, we have this very monolithic way of thinking about dependencies where the granularity of dependencies is an entire jar file. And, as soon as the happy world that I want to see come into being of people writing generative tests with specs becomes a little bit more established, it's going to be immediately followed by a sad world of, oh my God, these specs take a long time to run. Right?
Yes.
I used to write 10 unit tests that did 10 things. Now I write 10 specs that each do 1 million things each because they're generating 1 million cases. It takes a long time to run. We can be a lot smarter about dependencies and be able to say, you know what, I know. And you've seen some research on this. We had the Codec project with Datomic a few years ago. We can keep track of dependencies in a much more granular way and say, you know what, I know in this namespace, these 75 functions didn't change and this one did. And so if the spec doesn't depend on code that goes through a path that hits that one function, I don't need to run it again. And you can even take that information and share it, right? You could SHA that information up and put it in your GitHub repo and say, you know what? I already tested this. Here's a SHA certifying that I did. You don't ever have to run that again. So I think there's a lot of sophistication about what tests we run that ought to happen. Another thing I think that people will encounter is the programmability of specs themselves. So given a spec, you can call form and get back the form that was used to make the spec. But if you use specs for a while, you find yourself saying, you know what, I want to be able to write programs that, pick and choose and combine bits and pieces of other specs. And that's possible, but I think that could be easier and better. And so I think that's another area where, spec might, change and improve in the future. And I'm sure there are others, but those are, like I said, there are, 10,000, 15, 20,000 people, whatever, in the Clojure ecosystem. There's ideas from one person, but I think there are, we're going to see a lot of other ideas as people use it more.
I think, for me, I was thinking that, I kind of just thought about this, but one of the things that we've got are these, like, these support for strings and for ints and that kind of stuff. And we have that kind of thing in the reader as well. And the reader is extensible, but it seems like there's very little sharing of those extensions, let's say, except for between clients and servers in particular projects. But actually, there are quite generic things that could be useful outside of it. And I guess Spec should benefit from that as well eventually. There should be some kind of stuff built around or on top of that. Maybe it's not by you, but by the community to share, reuse commonly defined specs for domain-specific things, maybe.
Yeah, I think it would be fantastic. I mean,
like
how cool
money
would
and
it be?
dates and stuff like that,
Right, and well, not just money and dates, but like in terms of like the getting started experience is so important. What if all of the cool little sample apps in Clojure ended with having a spec that was, you would reuse if you were actually doing real work in that domain, right? So if you actually were building the next big to-do list or whatever, right? or the next big pet store,
you go real to the heart of it, Stuart,
that you would already have the appropriate specs for that domain. But it would demonstrate the value prop, and the real point is that we could have spec sharing, and I think that will happen, and it's just a matter of, right now people are still just integrating the ideas.
Just one. I mean, maybe this will sound a bit sucky to you, maybe, but I think that what you guys have done with the spec guide is really good. And you yourself have done a series of videos about how to use this thing. The community has really stepped up and I think made a lot of articles and tools and stuff like that. Honestly, for me, this feels like really not the first time, I don't know. Feels like for me, maybe living through it, it's a really great way to introduce new technology. It almost feels like it's been planned, or you guys have kind of like done a really great job of putting it out there and engendering kind of enthusiasm. And I don't know, was there a plan around this, or is it just kind of like we'll do it this way and then we'll adapt? Or did you have a kind of strategy for releasing this to the world in a certain way? And because it all seems to have worked, I just wondered if it was kind of forethought or if it's just been serendipity.
So, well, first, thanks. I mean, I'm pleased. I'm pleased that people were able to get into Spec, and I think that the work that Alex Miller did on the guide is an important piece of that.
Yeah.
And it's easy to prove out your statement, right? We can go look at the number of things that are interesting and powerful and complicated in Clojure, and then we can go and look at the number of things that are have guides for them, and there's very few guides. And so we have I guess Chaz Emmerich originally, and then more recently Cognitect have run the State of Clojure survey, and so it is a feedback item. Every year, more and better documentation, and so and I agree, more and better documentation is a really good thing. It's a really good thing, and so the guide, I think. I think first off, I want to say that I think that the Clojure community as a value nails it on emphasizing rationales, right? Having a rationale and explaining why you're doing what you're doing and situating it in a context of other things is incredibly valuable. And I think that there's a good job being done there. I think there's a lot of work that could be done at the guide level, which I think is the next thing you want. And so, yeah, there was definitely, thinking about how to build this. It was like, okay, rationale, check. We know we do that. That's how we roll. And then it was like, okay, what is the next highest value thing that could possibly be made? And I think to me, the answer was guide. And so that's why we did it. And I think people liked it, but it would be great to get feedback on what other things people would like. And then I think the videos that I did and other things are really kind of third order, right? That's nice. And there are people who want to, get things from videos, and that's great. But I would, if I could only do one thing, I would do the rationale. And if I could only do two things, I would do the rationale and then the guide. So I'm pretty happy with the order that we did things. And it would be great to have more guides. It would be great to have people looking for the best writing in Clojure blogs and reaching out to them and saying, hey, you ought to make that a guide. You ought to go, contributing to the Clojure website has never been easier. It's by pull request. So it's very, a workflow that people are familiar with. And Alex Miller helps people shepherd, things that they're writing through in there. So it would be great to have more guides.
Yeah. So let's, I think, because I'd like to know what your typical day is like. Most of the time, do you spend on Datomic, or do you spend on customer projects, or how does it work with you at Cognitect?
So it varies, from time to time. But in terms of the things that I am working on right now, I spend the bulk of my time thinking about making the Datomic experience on the cloud better.
Yeah.
And then I spend a substantial minority of my time thinking about development at the REPL and how to really evangelize the REPL, particularly to Clojure developers. And I think that we undersell the dynamic development aspect of Clojure. If you go to the website, if you go and look, and I was surprised when I was doing the research. I'm giving a couple of talks on REPL development in Chicago in a few weeks. And I was surprised when I went back to the website, Clojure lists dynamic development before functional programming. It lists it before Lisp. It is the first thing on the list, as this is really important. And it's not just about being dynamically typed. It's about having this tangible runtime that you have a streaming interaction with, that you can evolve and change while you're programming. And so I think trying to right now for me, it's like trying to take what is sort of unconscious competence, things that I do that I don't even know that I'm doing, and turn them into prose or blog posts or conference talks, and thinking about how to, share that with others, and also encourage other people to share their stories. Because every time I talk to anybody about how they use Clojure at the REPL, I learn something, right? My experience is one experience, but there are other interesting experiences as well. I happen to have been thinking about that all weekend, so I'm kind of gushing probably.
Nice. So as I said, bulk of the time you're spending on Datomic. So Datomic has been like of course, as you said, it's almost 5 years since Datomic has been released, and there has been a lot of chatter around when it was released. People were asking, okay, why it is not open source, and we also got a couple of questions from Twitter, which are essentially centered around. I think one from Nola Stowe. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it's a Clojure geek on Twitter. He says, will Datomic will ever be open source at a lower price? And there is another one, Spiral Ganglion, and it's also fairly similar to that one. This is the question says they have a very small startup, and they want to use Datomic. They're very very much in love with Datomic, but the pricing seems to be only open source or enterprise or VC kind of thing. So these two questions, I mean, this has been there for 5 years now, right? Will it ever be open source? Will it ever be, I don't know, so cheap that anybody can buy it?
So just to tell people who maybe have not followed the history, so we have had, first let me just say, I feel incredibly lucky that we launched a product that a lot of our interest comes from the Clojure ecosystem, and that we have people who are incredibly enthusiastic. And so, our community of people who are trying Datomic and our customer base have been incredibly nice and supportive. And so it has been a really fun process of evolving the product. And we have evolved the licensing model and the product and the pricing, 2 or 3 times over the 5 years, and all of that was in close consultation, both with customers and with people who were about to be customers and people who were a little bit further out and said, well, I can't be a customer because of X, Y, and Z. And so that dialogue has been really interesting and challenging. And the changes that we have made have been very well received. So, and that's because, we came out with our initial story and then we, entered the market and we found out, what we thought that was correct and what we thought that wasn't correct and, made changes. So that's been good. Having said that, talking specifically about the pricing, part of my interest in making Datomic experience better on the cloud comes from our history. We launched Datomic as a cloud-only, a very future-thinking database. It only ran in the cloud. And the very first thing that happened was some people said, great, and they started using it on the cloud. But a lot of people said, we want to run that in our data centers. So we got dragged from future think right back into present think. And over the last 5 years have done a lot of work on the Datomic experience in data centers. And that's work that's not super visible in the surface area of the product, the API. It doesn't make a difference there, right? That's been stable. But in terms of interactions with customers and helping them run on their storage or, work around strange things about their data center, which nobody else would care about. And those are people who are willing to pay for software. And so, that's been an important part of the story. At this point, we have the time and the resources and the flexibility to be really refocused on cloud again. Right, we have good answers for people who are running in data centers, and of course, our customer base is 5 years further in the future than they were 5 years ago, and so they are more ready to be in the cloud, and so on. And so we're able to look at things to say, okay, Datomic is already split apart compared to a traditional monolithic database. A monolithic database has these, high value, high ceremony, sacred processes that you have to sort of baby along, and Datomic really breaks that model, and it says we presume cheap ephemeral read resources that are distinct from cheap ephemeral write resources that are distinct from cheap ephemeral storage resources, any of which might fail. And the architecture is designed like that. But there's more that we could do there. We could make it simpler still. We could break apart parts that are currently delivered together. We could also do more automation. So more of you focus on the semantics of your application, and Datomic does more operationally for you, so you don't have to worry about that. And when you simplify further, and when you automate those pieces, so simplifying, as people who come to Clojure sometimes learn, simplifying, the short run is not always fun, right? You had one thing that was really complicated that did what you want, and now you have 10 things that are simpler that you have to put back together to do what you want, but you're going to be able to make them do other things in the future. But once you have that simple thing, once you've got simple sort of sorted out, you can really focus on easy. And you can say, how can we assemble those 10 pieces and make it really easy for this use case without compromising on the simplicity? And one of the things that comes out of that then is the ability to deliver a more granular Datomic and a more elastic Datomic. And this is just facts of the software and facts of its operation. It has nothing to do, it seems, at the front with the business model. But once it's more granular and more elastic, then that lets you come back and revisit the pricing model, right? Because now you can say you have super tiny granular Datomic that's suitable for a hobby project. So that's definitely an interest and definitely an area where I'm spending my time right now.
Okay, and. What is so I'm assuming that the open source thing is kind of a no-go for this one, because you want to keep it like a closed source one with the core team being Cognitect. Sorry, the Datomic Inc.
Yes, that's right. Datomic is not and will not become open source. So that's an easily answered question.
Yeah. And is there a plan or something that you're going to build your own storage engine for it, or you're always going to piggyback on, I don't know, Amazon, Redis or Postgres, or so you keep using the same storage modules? So
that's an interesting question. We already built a storage engine for it back in 2011, right? 5 weeks before we were going to ship, Amazon announced DynamoDB, and we took a look at that, and we looked at, and we were happy with our storage. It was Rich Hickey certified simple, but it was a new thing. It was a new thing that people had to run on their own behalf, and there's not a need for that. People are not looking to us. I mean, people are much more interested in one of two things. Either they want to run Datomic in their own data center, in which case they would be happier if it ran on storage that they already know how to manage. And that has been a really big value prop. But then the other side of it is they just want it to do everything and they don't care how it does it. And in that world, if we were going to release a more sort of shrink-wrapped, you press a button on the internet and 30 seconds from now you have Datomic instead of you're running processes on your own or whatever, then how that works under the hood doesn't really matter to you, but B, I would be much more likely to use something that was well established that you could point at and say, hey, rock solid storage provided by DynamoDB or whatever.
Actually, there is another little question that people get there is that if you want to move, because Amazon is the big, the kind of gorilla in the room, the elephant in the room, whatever you want to call it, not the elephant, the gorilla. It's the big thing. I'm great with words. I've got the best words. So you've got the big Amazon guys, but some of my friends, they run a Datomic, a company that runs on Datomic, and they'd like to move to the Google Cloud. And suddenly they're kind of like, oh God, nightmare, or Joyant, or something like that. So they have to run Cassandra themselves, or they have to run something else. Do you think about, maybe, this is not on the list of questions, but what the hell, do you think about potentially looking at other DynamoDB-like storage servers on Google or Joyant or Microsoft or other cloud providers?
So we keep an eye on all of those things to varying degrees, and those degrees are really determined by feedback that we get from users.
Right.
So, which I should take the time to mention that just in the last 6 months, we rolled out a system where people can do feature voting.
Actually, there was a question about that. Yeah, so you're killing a question as well. That's awesome,
now we can take care of a question as well. Yeah. So the question I think was, how's that working out? And the answer is pretty well. So I think that this is something that the Clojure ecosystem could actually benefit from as well, which is, feature voting, features and feature voting really ought to be totally separate from bug tracking. And right now, sometimes feature requests in the Clojure ecosystem come in through Jira, which is just not where I want to manage feature requests ideally. So with Datomic, there's a separate system for doing feature requests, and people can vote. And it has the important property that you have a certain amount of power, and you can choose where you spend your power. So you can't go in there and vote, say, I think all 100 things that people have asked for are equally important, because that doesn't really add information, right? You have to choose where you're going to spend your capital. That's been helpful. We've probably knocked off a half dozen features that people requested through the system. We could definitely, would appreciate more people going in there, especially things like, I'm running on this particular cloud or this particular storage system, and I could use Datomic if it was running there. We don't have enough people using it yet that you could draw strong quantitative conclusions. So it's going well, but we'd love to have more feedback.
So on the Datomic itself, I remember maybe it was a long time ago, even on the mailing list, you said you're working on a book. So how is it coming along? Or is it on the horizon?
So one of the things you'll notice consistently across the Clojure and Datomic ecosystems is we are very circumspect about providing calendars for the future or roadmaps because we've been writing software all our lives, and we know how unrealistic those things are. As an experiment, just to prove to myself that roadmaps are incredibly terrible and painful, I decided that I would make a prediction on the calendar about writing a Datomic book. And I can tell you that from having made that prediction, which I think came and passed like a year ago, that I have again been reminded of my lesson and will no longer make calendar predictions.
I know what it is, though, actually, Stuart. I know what it is. Because you kind of gave us the clue earlier on in this conversation, which is that when you get a book, you'll go 1-0 with Datomic. And until then, you're not going to do it.
That's right. That's right. It's all tied together. So it is definitely. I mean, I write about Datomic all the time, and it is my intention to write a cool book about Datomic that I will be really proud of, and that hopefully will be very useful for people. And I'm going to make no more calendar statements because I am appropriately chastened by the colossal failure of the last statement that I made.
There was some other questions which I think, since we just stick on Datomic for a little bit longer, because we do want to talk about some other bits and pieces as well. But we're going a little bit longer today, but I think we can take that. So because it's such a fascinating conversation. So the other thing is, and I've been interested in this for a long time, is whether Datomic will actually ever support another language, peers especially. Will peers run without the JVM? Will you ever run that on a JavaScript environment, for instance?
Well, certainly language support for Datomic is an area that we want to be very user-driven. And so that's one of the things that people, vote for on the site. I also think it's important, as much as I love the peer model, and if you've used Datomic, you may have also come to love the peer model. Since November of last year, we've had a more traditional client model, and I could imagine that in the fullness of time, that the majority of Datomic users will be on the client model. Certainly in the client model, once the client wire protocol is out of alpha, that will be fully specified, and we will both work to implement clients and to support other people with technical resources implementing clients. So I would say that in the short run, if you're running not on Java, not on Clojure, it's a lot more likely to have an awesome client than it is to have an awesome peer. Really delivering the peer experience is deliver the Clojure experience in another platform so you can deliver the peer experience.
But we've kind of got that with Clojure script and the CLR, so I guess that's a yes then.
Well, it's
no, I know it's not that
doable.
easy. I get that. Yeah,
it's not that easy. It's not that easy. There's a lot of platform sensitive code in the peer, and there's not a lot of platform sensitive code in clients. I mean, it's an intrinsic trade off, and the peer provides a fantastic locality, and along with that locality, you're sort of wedded to the platform. So, will there in the fullness of time be other peers? I don't know. Will there in the fullness of time be a lot more language clients? Almost certainly.
So
excellent.
Maybe we can.
Sorry, go on, Vijay. Yeah.
Yeah. So maybe we can talk about the recent ongoings as the last topic. So there has been some kerfuffle on the internet saying Clojure is dying, blah blah blah, something, and that kind of stuff. And then there is a lot of discussion. Of course, there are, as Ray was pointing out before we started recording, that there are some valid points or valid criticisms that Clojure can do better, or Clojure community can do better. And we had Eric Normand on the show as well, the functional TV, and he also wrote a blog post about what Cognitect can do better to mobilize the community. So what are your thoughts on this one, this whole thing that is going on right now, the Clojure community?
Well, there's a lot to say because this touches a lot of different things. First off, I would say that Eric's blog post was quite thoughtful, and so people should read that. I think it was very very considered on all sides. I think that it's difficult to. So first off, there are always problems, and we should strive to learn from each other and from other language communities. And I think that one of the great things about the Clojure ecosystem is that enthusiasts for Clojure tend to come from very disparate technology backgrounds. And so throughout most of my career, every time I hopped from one language to another, I was going with a large cohort of other people going in the same direction as me. And when I came to Clojure, I realized that I was hitting this melting pot of really different cohorts of people coming from different interests and different backgrounds. And so because of that, I think there's a potential to sort of, you think you understand the whole elephant, but you really just have your hand on the elephant's trunk or on the elephant's tail. And so people don't necessarily see, what the experiences of other people are. Just to be quantitative about the Clojure experience, we find that the vast number of people coming to ClojureConf every year are new, right? It's like almost 50% people who are new to Clojure, new to the conference that year. So I think that that's healthy evidence that there is a large funnel of people coming to Clojure. And I would suspect, if we could do the data analysis, that if you looked at the other Clojure conferences, the regional conferences and other events that people are running, that those things tend to pick up more advanced users and people who have been in Clojure longer, that they know the overall ecosystem better. They have a better idea of what they want and what they're interested in. They're hunting by topic. for what conference they're going to go to, instead of, hey, I'm new here, I should go to the big one. And that's all great. And it's fantastic to see, especially in Europe, all the little Clojure conferences that have sprung up, in the last couple of years, but not just in Europe, in other places as well. One of the anecdotes that was selected to make the argument that Clojure is stagnant was that the mailing list traffic seems to have leveled off. And what has actually happened there, I think, is, it's kind of ironic, because in 1 week you have the mailing list is leveled off, is Clojure dying, followed by the number of Clojure users on Slack are going to overwhelm Slack's free tier, and Slack's going to fall over. And so what I think happened is that Slack... I think what happened was, Slack got very trendy for a certain subset of the Clojure community, and they went there preferentially to the mailing list. I think it's great that the community is big and diverse enough that, and maybe people have, different ways that they want to communicate, that people are in different places. So I think that from a numbers perspective, there are a lot of different proxies you could look at. You could look at downloads from Maven Central of Clojure, which just are on a sort of ongoing uptrend over time. So it's very difficult to interpret any of this information, obviously, including the Maven downloads, right? It could be one big company just started downloading in a bunch, in a given month. Who knows? But, I see a thriving ecosystem in terms of the people that I interact with, and I see a lot of interest in the growth of the tech, and in particular the additive growth. I mean, I think the thing that's just stunning about Clojure is that it's had a series of things that felt revolutionary in terms of your experience. You had Clojure script, you had core async, you had transducers. Now we have Spec. All these things that feel like, wow, this is a revolution in how I think about writing my code. But if you look at what they actually did to your Clojure programs, they're additive. Right? These are all additive changes. None of those things I named broke existing Clojure programs. Right? All of and that's just amazing that over 10 releases that we keep doing that. And I think that as long as we continue to focus in terms of the tech on making that kind of additive change, that you're going to see people who are building businesses around Clojure appreciate that and say, you know what, I wrote code 5 years ago and it still works. And I think that the talk that Rich gave at the last Conj about compatibility, speculation was the title of the talk, is very well worth people in the Clojure community understanding. I think we have an opportunity to show leadership there in how we manage naming and releasing artifacts. And I think that we could, pervasively throughout the entire ecosystem, build software that's more stable in the face of change. And I think that will really facilitate, people not just coming to Clojure, but staying with Clojure once they're there.
So if you have to pick up something like based on different kinds of feedback from, as you said, when people are coming from different backgrounds, they have different priorities. They look at different things in the community. From being a one of the core core team member, and as the guy who is looking into every line of code that is getting into Clojure, what would be your first preference, and what is the first thing that you would like to do better?
So I think there's a couple of things there. One of them is that there's a difference between what happens to Clojure and what happens to the ecosystem, and so it's important to keep those two things separate in your mind. One of the rules for Clojure, and this should be true for any programming language, is don't make any change here that you don't have to make here. Right? If you look at a problem and say, I could solve this in Clojure, or I could solve this in a library, and the answer, and there's not a compelling reason to solve it in Clojure, you ought to make that solution in a library. If you look, and that goes further, if you look at a problem and say, you know what, we could solve this in Clojure, or we could solve it in a library, or we could solve it, with documentation or a convention about how we work as people in the ecosystem without writing code at all, we probably should solve it there, right? So we want to find ways to make the changes, where they should be made in the right layer of the stack. The flip side of that is you want to make changes in the core that are going to be most impactful to the broadest set of uses. And you want to think generally and not in terms of, one-off solutions to problems and band-aids like that. So that's kind of some of the technical prioritization. But then the other thing is to realize, it may be the case that the biggest problems the Clojure ecosystem is facing don't require language changes to Clojure at all, but they're still worth working on. And so, one of the reasons that I'm focusing on the Clojure experience at the REPL right now is that my experience doesn't gel with some of the concerns other people have. And I want to explore that and say, look, when I encounter the problem you're describing, here's how I would solve it at the REPL. And I want to have that conversation before I would make a change to Clojure. Right. And that conversation might lead to me realizing, you know what, I have experience blindness here. And so I don't see the thing that you're seeing. And once I can see it through your eyes, then we can, do something different. But I would, certainly there's a recurring theme of documentation could be better. And, what is the most powerful thing one person could do to make documentation better? I could write documentation, right? That's the thing that I could do. Or the core team could say documentation is now managed via pull request on GitHub, which it was not until, a year ago when that change was made. So that is a much higher leverage change than any specific piece of documentation I could write, right? And it opens the door for a much larger group of users, to come in and make needed improvements to documentation. And so that's the kind of change, the kind of higher leverage change. It doesn't require a change to the language or pointing out to someone, you've encountered this problem and you have, developed a patch to Clojure that would solve this problem. But here's a solution that could be done in a library that doesn't require a patch to Clojure. That's a much lower bar. It also provides a lower cost way to vet the solution and try it out in production for a year, before we make a change to Clojure in the same area. So those are some of the kinds of things that I would look at in terms of priority setting.
The thing I was going to ask you also, Stuart, was because you run a company as well, you're kind of eating your own dog food when you go out and do consultancy gigs. I think what some people are looking towards, and we see this in some of the questions actually, is what kind of tools or templates or libraries or those kind of power packs, if you like, do you guys put together on consulting gigs that might help other people have success? Is that it doesn't have, that's definitely not a change to Clojure, and it's not even a change to Clojure.org, but is it something which, your kind of experience as a consulting company could help to kind of give people a better leg up or a bigger lift and a leverage in terms of, what you're doing real world in terms of your consulting assignments?
Yeah, that's a good question. And let me take it in a one-off way and then in a maybe sort of a step back kind of way. So one thing that Cognitect has produced that is a power pack that's grown out of the consultancy building things is Pedestal, right? So Pedestal is not the dominant way necessarily people build web applications in Clojure. It is the dominant way probably that people at Cognitect currently build web applications in Clojure, but that's not a mandate, right? This is we're up in toolkit land, and so different projects are going to have different needs and different mandates. But this is a concrete example of something that's being battle tested in consulting engagements, and then as a second thought, given away as open source and documented and reaching out to people and trying to sort of help people adopt it where it would be relevant. It's not necessarily going to be a one-size-fit-all solution. On the other hand, it was devised and has a rationale for specific problems that at the time it was created, other Clojure web toolkits didn't cover. And so it's a concrete example of that, does Cognitect, how could Cognitect share a power pack of things that we have built to solve problems.
Okay, I think there's a general. I don't know. I think there's a general feeling that Pedestal hasn't got the kind of adoption in the community that maybe was foreseen. There could be reasons behind that. But we can leave that for another discussion. But I guess the question is, if that's what you're mostly doing, then that's what you're going to push, and that's fine. I guess there should be other consultancies like Juxt and people like that. They're also pushing their toolkits, and that's all fine also. So
I think there's a higher level of value that we can add, though, which is that we are in conversations probably with more big stodgy enterprise companies using Clojure than almost anybody else. I mean, we try to talk to everybody out there, and so I can relay, some feedback from there. And I've been doing this over the weekend. If you've been following me, tweet over the weekend. One of the challenges that we have is that we sometimes make things sort of too much for ourselves. And the way that this shows up, this is the symptom and not the cause, is the lining and pluginization of valuable tools. Yeah. And so people say, well, when I make a tool for the Clojure ecosystem, the first thing on my documentation, on my README should be, here's the line plugin for using this. And they justify that by saying, look, 90% of Clojure projects per the Clojure survey use Leiningen. Now, these things are all true, but we're going out and evangelizing to the non-converted. And let me tell you, the non-converted do not use Leiningen, right? and the non-converted who have money to spend writing software, we all know what they use, right? Yeah. If they're in the JVM ecosystem, they use Maven. Yeah. And so I have been reaching out to individual Clojure projects and saying, hey, look, can you please document your story, your library story for a Maven user? And lead with that. I mean, they may not lead with that, and there are reasons not to. I understand that and this is not about Leiningen or even Maven. It's really about, we are producing tools that are usually kind of functional tools, and so I want a functional entry point. And having a Leiningen plugin or a Maven plugin would also be wrong, by the way. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Right. A Maven plugin would be wrong for the same reasons that a Leiningen plugin would be wrong, for the same reasons that a Gradle plugin would be wrong. Right. The right way to do it is to say, here's the jar file, and here's its Maven coordinate in Maven format, and here's its Maven coordinate in Leiningen format. And we definitely have projects where we are prohibited from using Leiningen. Yeah. So and that, and we have projects where we're prohibited from using Clojars. So another thing I would say to people is that if you're trying to facilitate, enterprise use of Clojure, I understand that it's more of a pain in the neck to put things in Maven Central, right? Sure. That there's a higher bar there. Yeah. But you are, if you're out there saying, I want to do open source and do a favor to other people, then if you put things in Maven Central, they are going to be able to reach a much broader set of users than just the Clojure ecosystem as it exists today. So those are kind of, higher order feedback on the topic of how do we make a better power pack? We can make the stuff we have into a better power pack by making it more consumable by people who don't necessarily share all of our presumptions about how we build stuff.
Yeah. Okay, then one final question. Then I think we can. I think we took almost 1.5 hours. Wow, it's like one of those longest. But of course, very informative, and it's a pleasure when we can continue talking for hours. And then I know it's never-ending things in Clojure world. But
we'll just make it an annual thing, Stu. Okay, from now
exactly.
on. Okay. Standing invite.
So
sounds good to me.
Excellent. Rich Hickey is in some sort of a witness protection program or something. I mean, how do you protect him? Because he seems to be like the guy for everything. And then, people are kind of concerned that what happens? What is the future of the Clojure when it has a buzz factor of 1?
So the political party that is worried about Clojure, if Rich Hickey's gone, must be like the opposite faction from the political party who's worried about that Clojure is dying or that they don't like how things are going right now. So I suggest that we let those two political parties fight it out and the rest of us get back to writing software.
100%. Awesome.
Okay.
Well, wow. No, I was just going to say it's been a great conversation. I think I want to let Stuart get on with his day though, and
I think so.
I think we've taken up a hell of a lot of time, and it's been a great time.
But we would love to have you back on the show, by the way. I mean, we still need to pick your brain on a lot of other things as well. I know it's 1.5 hours is not enough. And one thing that I noticed is that you're extremely good with names. I think probably that's because of you're a historian or something. I don't know. I mean, you're very specific about people's names. So usually when you're in a conversation, people start with, I'm not good with the names, that guy there and then that girl there. And so.
Well, I appreciate that. I mean, I try to be precise. I think it's, we talk about Clojure, valuing simplicity, and certainly that's a distinctive thing. And, Rich gave a great talk about it, but I think that valuing kindness and respect is another thing that is very important in the Clojure community, and that we try to lead by example in the forums that we started, things like the mailing list. And I think that's been a very important part of Clojure success, is people being able to, expect that they're going to be treated with respect and kindness in interactions. So I think that's another important thing. And I would close by mentioning, because we should have mentioned this at some point, that this is going to be the 10th Conj this year. So this is going to be an event of extreme splendiferousness, and I'm super excited about it. I think it's going to be the announcement's going to come out sometime in the next couple of weeks. I'm not sure how long between this recording and when this publishes, but maybe it'll even be out by the time the podcast is out. I think I'm probably going to be doing a day-long workshop on making Datomic awesome in the cloud. So
excellent.
We didn't spend a lot of time talking about that today, but something that has been dominating my thoughts over the past year, and I'm eager to get out and talk about it with other people. So hopefully we'll see some people there. Certainly hope I'll see both of you at Conj if it's possible.
We'll
we could
if
be
not,
media sponsors, okay? We'll have to find a way, but...
That's right.
Yes,
we'll have to work that out.
Yeah.
That's right.
As
You're
long as
press
we get press passes, we'll show up.
We'll talk about that off air, Stu, okay?
Great.
But I think it's on that
Bombshell.
note. I think we can. Yeah. Well, I expected a bombshell, but it was much more like a proper way of as you said, Clojure community. The community thing is one thing that I really like about Clojure. The way people being kind to each other and then being good and then doing good. So thanks a lot for joining the podcast. It's almost 1 year, and it's been an absolute pleasure for us to talk to different people at Cognitect and different people in Clojure world.
Yeah.
And we've been learning a lot talking to all these people. So this is something that we really appreciate. And it's been almost 1.5 hours, and we'd like to wrap it up now. And thank you, Stuart Halloway. And I don't know if I can call you Stu. Is that okay?
Stu is fine. Stuart is fine. Whatever.
Perfect. Thanks again. And we'd like to wrap up by reading some credits. So the music is by Pizzeri as the intro music and the outro music.
We might actually change the music this time, This is a bit post hoc, but we might change it for a special...
Still made by him.
Made by him, but a different track maybe to signify the regal presence of Mr. Halloway.
Oh, you're really embarrassing me now.
to honor this special episode with a
Exactly.
special number starting the episode. And our artwork is done by Lubov Sultan, and you find the links in the technical notes. And of course, as we'll add a lot of links that Stuart will send us and in the show notes. And that's it from us for episode number 23. And this is Vijay signing off.
Yeah, likewise, Ray. Thanks again, Stu. It's been an absolute pleasure. Cheers.
Thanks very much, guys. Have a great afternoon.